James Anderson, a 45-year-old CEO, was a man whose life was as meticulously structured as the luxury hotel empire he had built from the ground up. Born into a modest family in Vancouver, James was the product of perseverance and grit. His parents ran a small bed and breakfast, a quaint establishment that instilled in him a deep appreciation for hospitality. Unlike many of his peers who inherited their positions, James fought for every inch of success. His journey was a testament to late nights poring over financial statements and early mornings spent greeting guests with a genuine smile. The Anderson bed and breakfast had been a labor of love for his parents, situated on the outskirts of Vancouver with just 12 rooms and a small dining area. As a 10-year-old boy, James would wake before dawn to help his mother prepare breakfast for the guests. The satisfaction in their eyes when they tasted his mother's homemade muffins left a lasting impression on him. It was during those formative years that James learned the most valuable lesson in hospitality: genuine service could never be faked. At 17, James experienced his first major setback. A devastating fire ravaged the family business, leaving behind charred remains and shattered dreams. The insurance barely covered half the damage, and his parents, already in their 60s, contemplated giving up. That night, James sat at their kitchen table, the smell of smoke still clinging to his clothes, and made a promise one day: he would rebuild their legacy tenfold. "We'll start again," he had insisted, his young voice filled with determination that belied his years. His parents exchanged glances, touched by his resolve but unaware of the fire he had ignited within himself. Through a combination of student loans, part-time jobs, and sheer determination, James put himself through business school. His classmates spent weekends partying, but James worked double shifts at local hotels, absorbing every facet of the hospitality industry. At 25, he secured a loan to purchase a failing motel. Most called it a foolish venture, James called it an opportunity. Within 3 years, he transformed the dilapidated property into a boutique destination. By 35, he had acquired 7 more properties, each more luxurious than the last. Today, at 45, Anderson Luxury Hotels was a brand synonymous with excellence, with properties spanning 3 continents. From an early age, James was instilled with the values of hard work and dedication. His parents, though not wealthy, provided a nurturing environment where he learned the importance of service and attention to detail. As a child, he would help with small tasks around the inn, from setting tables to greeting guests. These early experiences sowed the seeds of ambition in him, driving him to pursue a career in hotel management. "Remember, James," his father would say, "in this business, it's not just about the rooms or the food. It's about how you make people feel." It was a mantra he carried into adulthood, one that guided his business philosophy. Despite his professional triumphs, James led a relatively solitary life. His commitment to his work left little room for personal relationships, and he had built walls around his heart, wary of letting anyone in. The few relationships he had attempted had ended the same way, with complaints of his emotional unavailability and workaholic tendencies. His last serious relationship had ended 3 years ago, when Catherine, a successful attorney he had dated for nearly a year, gave him an ultimatum: make more time for their relationship or she would walk away. James chose work, telling himself it was for the best. Since then, he had buried himself deeper in his business, expanding his hotel chain and avoiding anything resembling emotional vulnerability. Yet, beneath his composed exterior, there was a yearning for something more, a desire for connection and meaning beyond boardrooms and business deals. He often found himself gazing out of his office window, wondering if there was more to life than the relentless pursuit of success. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had created spaces where people made memories, fell in love, and celebrated life's milestones, yet his own life was devoid of such moments. Across town, Sarah Johnson, a 38-year-old single mother, was navigating life with a resilience that often went unnoticed. The vibrant city of Vancouver was both a playground and a battlefield for Sarah, who juggled multiple jobs to provide for her 8-year-old daughter, Emily. Life had dealt her a challenging hand. Widowed at a young age, Sarah was thrust into the role of sole provider. Her days were a whirlwind of cleaning hotel rooms and managing household duties, yet she faced each day with a smile for Emily, her greatest source of strength. Sarah's husband, Michael, had been a chef with dreams of opening his own restaurant. They had met when Sarah was working as a server at a local bistro, her natural charm and his culinary talent creating an instant connection. Their early years together were filled with late-night cooking sessions and ambitious plans for their future restaurant. Emily's birth had only strengthened their resolve to create a legacy. But fate had other plans. A sudden heart attack had claimed Michael's life when Emily was just 3, leaving Sarah devastated and alone. The grief had been overwhelming, but the practical realities of single motherhood had forced her to push through her pain. There was no time to fall apart. Emily needed her. The first year after Michael's death was a blur of grief counseling, job applications, and tear-soaked pillows. Sarah had been forced to sell their small house, moving into a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a less desirable neighborhood. Her dreams of returning to school to study culinary arts were shelved indefinitely. "Mommy, when can we get a dog?" Emily would often ask, her innocent question a reminder of the life they once thought they would have: a house with a yard, perhaps siblings for Emily, and yes, a family dog. Sarah would smile and say, "Someday, sweetheart," though the promise felt hollow. Yet, for all the hardships, Sarah maintained a quiet dignity. Her co-workers at the hotel knew her as the woman who never complained, who always had a kind word for everyone, even on the most grueling days. What they didn't see were the nights she spent at her small kitchen table, experimenting with recipes and jotting down ideas for the cafe she dreamed of opening. Sarah had always been passionate about food. She dreamed of opening a cafe where she could share her culinary creations with the world. This dream was a beacon of hope, a reminder of a future where she could thrive on her own terms. However, the immediate demands of her life seemed to push this aspiration further into the distance, leaving only traces of it in her late-night musings as she prepared dinner for Emily. Yet, in the quiet moments after Emily fell asleep, Sarah would sketch out ideas for her cafe, imagining the cozy space filled with the aroma of fresh pastries and the sound of friendly chatter. Her talent in the kitchen was undeniable. Sarah had a natural ability to identify flavors and combine ingredients in innovative ways. Her colleagues often marveled at the lunches she packed for herself, simple yet flavorful creations that made their commercial sandwiches seem bland in comparison. "You should sell these," one of her co-workers had suggested after tasting a piece of Sarah's homemade rosemary focaccia. Sarah had smiled, the compliment warming her heart, even as she dismissed the idea as impractical. Dreams, she had learned, were luxuries she couldn't afford. But despite the hardships, Sarah refused to be defined by her circumstances. She was determined to create a life of dignity and opportunity for herself and Emily. It was this quiet determination that would soon lead her onto a collision course with James Anderson, in an encounter that would change both their lives forever. One fateful evening, as the city lights twinkled in the distance, Sarah found herself assigned to clean the VIP suite in one of James's most prestigious hotels. It was the final task of a grueling double shift, and her body ached with exhaustion. The day had been particularly challenging. Emily had woken with a fever, forcing Sarah to scramble for a last-minute babysitter, an expense she could ill afford. Then, one of her co-workers had called in sick, leaving Sarah to pick up the slack. By the time she reached the VIP suite, her legs felt like lead and her eyelids drooped with fatigue. Stepping into the opulent suite, Sarah was momentarily taken aback by its grandeur. The bathroom alone was larger than her entire apartment, its marble surfaces gleaming under the soft lights. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the jacuzzi tub, and imported Italian tiles lined the floor. "Who needs this much space just to take a shower?" she muttered to herself, as she began methodically cleaning the surfaces. Her movements were automatic, born of years of practice, but her mind wandered to Emily. The babysitter had texted that her fever had broken, but Sarah still worried. Emily had inherited her father's tendency to downplay illness, a trait that both endeared and concerned Sarah. As she worked, the rhythmic motions of cleaning had a lulling effect, and Sarah found herself reminiscing about the cafe she longed to open. In her mind, she could see it clearly: warm wooden tables, a glass display case filled with colorful pastries, and the comforting hum of conversation. She imagined the specials she would create, seasonal dishes that showcased the best local ingredients. "I'd have a signature coffee blend," she murmured, her voice echoing slightly in the vast bathroom. "And fresh baked bread every morning." The fantasy was so vivid that she could almost smell the aroma. But soon, the weight of her fatigue became unbearable. She sat down on the closed toilet lid, intending to rest her eyes for just a moment. The marble was cool against her back, and the plush bath mat beneath her feet felt luxurious. "Just 5 minutes," she whispered, her eyes already closing. "5 minutes, and then I'll finish." The next thing she knew, she was being startled awake by a firm voice echoing through the bathroom. James Anderson's day had been a series of high-pressure meetings and difficult decisions. A potential investor had backed out at the last minute, leaving a significant funding gap for his new property in Montreal. His executive team was divided on the best course of action, and the tension during the afternoon meeting had been palpable. By the time he returned to his suite, his temples throbbed with a tension headache, and his shoulders were knotted with stress. All he wanted was to shed his corporate armor and enjoy a long, hot shower in peace. He had already loosened his tie and unbuttoned the top buttons of his shirt as he entered the suite. Not bothering to turn on the main lights, he headed straight for the bathroom, his mind still churning with strategies and contingencies for the Montreal property. He pushed open the bathroom door, reaching for the light switch, and then froze. "What the hell?" His voice bounced off the marble walls, louder than he had intended. There, slumped against the toilet, was a woman in a hotel uniform, sound asleep. For a moment, James stood dumbfounded, his brain struggling to process the bizarre scene. Was this some kind of prank? A security breach? He took a step back, instinctively reaching for his phone to call security. Sarah jolted awake at the sound, her eyes flying open in panic. In her disoriented state, she lost her balance and fell sideways, knocking over the cleaning caddy. Bottles of cleaning supplies clattered to the floor, one of them spilling blue liquid across the pristine tiles. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," she gasped, scrambling to her feet and nearly slipping on the cleaning solution. James automatically reached out to steady her, then quickly withdrew his hand as if burned. "Who are you?" "And what are you doing in my bathroom?" he demanded, his voice stern but no longer raised. Sarah's face flushed crimson as reality crashed down on her. She was in the VIP suite, she had fallen asleep on the job, and now she was face to face with a clearly annoyed guest, a very important guest, judging by his tailored suit and authoritative demeanor. "I'm Sarah Johnson, housekeeping," she stammered, her heart racing. "I was cleaning the suite and I didn't intend to." "You decided to take a nap in the middle of your shift?" James interrupted, his eyebrow raised. There was something almost amusing about the situation, though he was careful not to show it. "No." "Well, yes, but not intentionally," Sarah blurted out, desperately trying to gather her scattered thoughts. "I've been working since 6 a.m., and I just sat down for a second, and then..." She gestured helplessly, words failing her. To her surprise, instead of calling security or demanding to speak to her supervisor, James simply sighed and ran a hand through his dark hair. The gesture was oddly human, at odds with his otherwise imposing presence. "So, my bathroom is now a designated nap zone for the housekeeping staff?" he asked, but there was less edge to his voice now. Something about the genuine distress in her eyes had softened his initial irritation. "I swear, this has never happened before," Sarah said, hastily grabbing a towel to mop up the spilled cleaning solution. Her hands were trembling slightly, and she was keenly aware of how this incident could cost her the job she desperately needed. James watched her for a moment, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the weary slope of her shoulders. Despite the absurdity of the situation, he found himself curious about this woman who had fallen asleep in his bathroom. "Leave it," he said, gesturing to the spill. "Maintenance can handle it." Sarah looked up, surprised by his calm tone. "I'm really very sorry, sir. I understand if you want to file a complaint." James considered for a moment, then shook his head. "No complaint. But I would like a coffee, one that doesn't taste like the subpar brew they serve downstairs." Sarah blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected request. "You want me to bring you coffee?" "I want your opinion on the coffee," James clarified, stepping back to allow her to exit the bathroom. "Since you work here, I'm curious about your thoughts on the hotel's food and beverage offerings." Still bewildered by this turn of events, Sarah followed him into the main suite area, where he gestured toward the in-room coffee machine. "Try it," he suggested, handing her a cup of the freshly brewed coffee. Sarah hesitated, then took the cup. She sniffed it cautiously, then made a face. "This is terrible," she said, then immediately clamped her hand over her mouth, realizing she had just insulted the hotel's offerings to a VIP guest. To her astonishment, James laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that transformed his face, making him appear younger and more approachable. "You couldn't even fake it for politeness, could you?" Sarah felt a small smile tug at her lips. "Sorry, but no. It's over-roasted and bitter. They try to mask it with sugar in the main restaurant, but that only makes it worse." James raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "And you can tell this just from smelling it?" "Well, yes," Sarah replied, surprised by his interest. "My husband was a chef, and he taught me a lot about flavors and ingredients." James nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "Interesting. Very interesting." And in that moment, as the tension between them dissolved into something resembling a conversation, neither Sarah nor James could have predicted how this chance encounter would set in motion a chain of events that would transform both their lives. In the days that followed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of mortification that clung to her after the bathroom incident. Each time she passed the VIP suite during her rounds, her cheeks burned with embarrassment. She expected a call from her supervisor, a stern reprimand, or worse, a dismissal. Instead, she received an unexpected invitation from James to meet him in the hotel's cafe. Her mind raced with possibilities, each more daunting than the last. "He probably wants to fire me personally," she told her friend and fellow housekeeper, Mia, who looked equally perplexed by the summons. "That doesn't make sense," Mia replied, straightening Sarah's collar. "If he wanted you gone, he would have said something that night, or at least reported you to management. Then what could he possibly want?" Sarah wondered aloud, her stomach knotted with anxiety. Mia shrugged. "Maybe he was impressed by your coffee critique. Rich people are weird, Sarah. Just go and find out." When she arrived at the cafe, Sarah spotted James immediately. He was seated at a corner table, reviewing documents on his tablet, his expression intense. Several other patrons were stealing glances at him, clearly aware of his status. Sarah took a deep breath and approached, feeling woefully out of place in her simple blouse and jeans. James looked up as she neared, setting aside his tablet. "Ms. Johnson, thank you for coming," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Mr. Anderson," she replied, her voice more even than she felt. "I appreciate you not reporting me the other night, but if you've reconsidered, I understand. I take full responsibility for..." James held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "I didn't ask you here to fire you," he said, the hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I asked you here because I'm curious." Sarah blinked. "Curious? About what?" "About your palate," he replied, leaning back in his chair. "You identified issues with our coffee that our food and beverage director has been ignoring for months. I'd like to know what else you can tell me about the food service in my hotel." A server approached with a tray containing several small dishes. James nodded his thanks, then turned back to Sarah. "I've ordered a sampling of items from our breakfast menu. I'd like your honest assessment." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "You want me to taste the food and tell you what I think? Why?" "Because you have a gift," James replied simply. "And I don't believe in wasting talent." Hesitantly, Sarah began to taste the items. As she did, her initial awkwardness gave way to a focused concentration. She identified oversalted eggs, pastries that weren't freshly baked, and fruit that wasn't at its peak ripeness. With each observation, James's interest seemed to grow. "The chef is relying too heavily on salt to mask the use of lower quality dairy," she explained, pointing to the eggs. "And these croissants were likely made yesterday and reheated this morning, you can tell by the texture." James watched her with a mix of fascination and respect. "Where did you learn all this?" Sarah's expression softened, a touch of sadness in her eyes. "My husband, Michael, was a chef. We used to dream of opening our own place someday. He taught me to pay attention to flavors, to understand the science behind cooking." "And now?" James prompted gently. "He passed away 5 years ago," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the pain that still lingered. "I have a daughter to support, so those dreams got put on hold." James nodded, a newfound understanding in his gaze. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, and the sincerity in his voice surprised Sarah. It wasn't the perfunctory sympathy she had grown accustomed to, there was genuine compassion there. "Thank you," she said simply. After a moment of silence, James leaned forward, his expression turning thoughtful. I have a proposition for you, Ms. Johnson. I want to improve the dining experience at all of my hotels, and I believe you could help with that. Sarah raised an eyebrow. How? Work with me as a food consultant. You'd taste dishes, provide feedback, work with our chefs to implement improvements. It would be part-time initially, allowing you to keep your current position if you wish. Sarah's jaw dropped. You want me to be a food consultant? But I have no formal training, no credentials. You have a gift, James interrupted firmly. And I trust my judgment of people more than I trust pieces of paper. The question is, do you trust yourself enough to take this opportunity? The offer was so unexpected, so far removed from her daily reality, that Sarah didn't know how to respond. Part of her wanted to leap at the chance, while another part whispered cautions about getting involved with the enigmatic CEO. Can I think about it? She asked finally. James nodded, sliding a business card across the table. Take all the time you need. But not too much, he added with a small smile. I'm not a patient man. As Sarah left the cafe, her mind was spinning. The opportunity could change everything for her and Emily, yet it seemed too good to be true. What did James Anderson really want from her? And was she brave enough to find out? That evening, as she tucked Emily into bed, her daughter noticed her distraction. What's wrong, Mommy? Emily asked, her eyes wide with concern. Sarah smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Emily's forehead. Nothing's wrong, sweetheart. I might have a new opportunity at work, that's all. A good opportunity? Emily asked. Sarah considered the question. I think so. It's different from what I usually do, and a little scary, but also exciting. Emily nodded sagely, with the simple wisdom of childhood. Dad always said if something scares you a little, it's probably worth doing. Sarah's heart clenched at the memory of Michael saying those exact words. It was as if he was reaching across time, encouraging her to take the leap. The next morning, Sarah called the number on James's card. When he answered, she took a deep breath and said, I'd like to accept your offer, Mr. Anderson. Excellent, James replied, and she could hear the satisfaction in his voice. And please, call me James. Then you should call me Sarah, she replied, a new confidence in her tone. And so began their unlikely partnership. At first, their interactions were strictly professional. Sarah would meet with James and the hotel's culinary team twice a week, providing insights and suggestions. She was nervous initially, intimidated by the executive chefs and their formal training. But James insisted that she speak her mind, overriding objections from staff who resented taking direction from someone they saw as just a housekeeper. One particularly tense meeting stood out in Sarah's memory. The executive chef, a stern man named Bernard with decades of experience, had dismissed her suggestion to source bread from a local artisanal bakery. With all due respect, Mrs. Johnson, he said, his tone making it clear he had little respect to offer, you're suggesting we increase our costs by 40% for bread. That's not practical. Sarah felt her cheeks flush, but before she could respond, James intervened. Bernard, what's our bread return rate currently? He asked calmly. The chef hesitated. About 30% of bread served at dinner is left untouched. And how much do we spend replacing that wasted bread? James pressed. Bernard shifted uncomfortably. approximately $2,000 per week. So if better bread means guests actually eat it, we might actually save money, James concluded, nodding at Sarah. Let's try her suggestion for 2 weeks and track the results. The chef had no choice but to agree, though his expression remained skeptical. 2 weeks later, bread waste had decreased by 75%, and guest satisfaction scores for the dining experience had increased by 15%. After that meeting, Sarah found James waiting for her in the hallway. "You were right," he said without preamble. "And you knew you were right, but you let Bernard talk down to you." Sarah sighed. "It's complicated. I'm not used to people taking me seriously in this context." "Well, get used to it," James replied firmly. "You earned your place at that table. Don't let anyone make you forget it." His words stayed with her, bolstering her confidence in subsequent meetings. Over time, she found her voice, and the culinary staff began to respect her insights, even if some remained wary of her unusual position. As weeks turned into months, Sarah and James's professional relationship began to evolve. They spent more time together, often continuing discussions over dinner after meetings. Sarah found herself sharing stories about Emily, about her dreams for the cafe, about the life she had shared with Michael. To her surprise, James was an attentive listener, offering thoughtful responses and occasionally sharing glimpses of his own life. One evening, after a particularly successful implementation of Sarah's dessert recommendations resulted in rave reviews from hotel guests, James suggested they celebrate with dinner at a small, out-of-the-way restaurant he frequented. "No business talk," he insisted as they were seated at a quiet corner table. "Tonight we're just two people enjoying a meal." As they dined, Sarah noticed a different side of James. Away from the corporate environment, he was more relaxed, his smile coming more easily, his laugh more frequent. She found herself drawn to this version of him, even as she reminded herself of the vast differences in their lives. "Tell me about your parents," she asked, genuinely curious about the man behind the CEO facade. James twirled pasta on his fork, his expression softening. "They were simple people with extraordinary hearts," he said. "They ran a small B&B outside the city, taught me everything I know about hospitality. My father believed in greeting every guest personally, remembering their names, their preferences. My mother could make anyone feel at home with just a cup of tea and her apple cinnamon muffins." "They sound wonderful," Sarah said, touched by the warmth in his voice. "They were," James agreed. "They passed away a few years ago, within months of each other. Sometimes I wonder what they would think of what I built." "I think they'd be proud," Sarah said softly. "Your hotels may be luxury establishments, but I've noticed how you insist on personal touches, on making guests feel welcome. That comes from them." James looked at her with surprise, as if seeing her in a new light. "Not many people understand that," he said. "They see the business, the brand, but not the heart behind it." "Maybe they're not looking closely enough," Sarah replied. As dinner concluded, James insisted on driving Sarah home. When they arrived at her modest apartment building, he seemed to hesitate, as if wanting to say something more. But the moment passed, and he simply thanked her for the evening. As Sarah watched his car pull away, she realized with a start that somewhere between business meetings and dinner conversations, James Anderson had become more than just her employer. He had become someone she looked forward to seeing, someone whose opinion mattered to her, someone she thought about even when they weren't together. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. Sarah had built careful walls around her heart after Michael's death, focusing all her energy on Emily and survival. The idea of those walls being breached, especially by someone as complicated as James, was unsettling. Yet, as she climbed the stairs to her apartment, she couldn't deny the small smile that played on her lips or the lightness in her step. Something had changed, something significant, and whether she was ready or not, Sarah knew her life was about to become much more complicated. The turning point in their relationship came with an invitation to Paris, a city synonymous with romance and culinary excellence. James, eager to showcase Sarah's talents on a larger stage, invited her to join him at a prestigious food event. The International Culinary Summit was a gathering of the world's most innovative chefs, food critics, and industry leaders, an opportunity that could open countless doors. Paris. Sarah repeated, certain she had misheard. They were in James's office, reviewing changes to the hotel's brunch menu when he casually mentioned the trip. "You want me to go to Paris with you?" James looked up from his computer, his expression matter of fact. "The summit is the perfect platform to introduce you to key figures in the culinary world. Your insights would be valuable, and the connections could benefit both you and the hotel." "But Paris," Sarah emphasized, overwhelmed by the suggestion. "That's halfway around the world, James. I can't just I have Emily, responsibilities here." James leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Emily could stay with her grandparents, couldn't she? It would only be for a week." Sarah paced the office, her mind racing. "It's not just about childcare. Paris is, it's another world. The summit would be full of professional chefs, food critics, people with actual credentials. What could I possibly contribute?" James rose from his desk, moving to stand before her. "Sarah, stop. You've transformed the dining experience at 3 of my hotels in just 6 months. Guest satisfaction is at an all-time high, and food waste is down by 40%. You have more to offer than most of the credentialed professionals I've met." His confidence in her was flattering, but Sarah still hesitated. The professional opportunity was undeniable, but there was another aspect of the trip that made her nervous: spending a week with James in the most romantic city in the world. Their relationship had remained firmly professional, despite the occasional dinner or the undeniable chemistry between them. Paris seemed like tempting fate. "I don't even have the right clothes for something like this," she said, grasping at practical objections. James waved dismissively. "The hotel has a personal shopper on staff. She can help you select appropriate attire, my treat." "I can't accept." "Consider it a business expense," James interrupted. "You're representing Anderson Hotels. It's important you look the part." Sarah bit her lip, torn between excitement and trepidation. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "And talk to Emily." James nodded, accepting her hesitation. "The summit is in 3 weeks. Let me know your decision by Friday." That evening, Sarah explained the opportunity to Emily over dinner, carefully gauging her daughter's reaction. To her surprise, Emily was enthusiastic. "Paris? Like in Ratatouille," she exclaimed, her eyes wide with excitement. "You have to go, Mom. You can see the Eiffel Tower and eat real French pastries." Sarah smiled at her daughter's enthusiasm. "But I'd be gone for a week, sweetie. You'd have to stay with Grandma and Grandpa." Emily shrugged, already imagining the souvenirs her mother might bring back. "That's okay. Grandma lets me have extra dessert, and Grandpa said he'd teach me to fish next time I visit. Later, after Emily was asleep, Sarah called her in-laws to discuss the arrangement. Michael's parents had remained a steady presence in their lives after his death, offering both emotional and practical support. They were immediately supportive of the opportunity. "Michael would want you to go," her father-in-law said gently. "He always believed in your talent, Sarah. This sounds like the chance of a lifetime." With Emily's care arrangements secured and her in-laws' blessing, Sarah accepted James's invitation. The weeks leading up to the trip were a whirlwind of preparation. As promised, James arranged for the hotel's personal shopper to help Sarah select appropriate attire. The experience was surreal, trying on designer dresses and selecting accessories that cost more than her monthly rent. "This is too much," she protested as the personal shopper added yet another item to the growing collection. "Mr. Anderson was quite clear," the woman replied with a professional smile. "He wants you to have everything you need to feel confident and comfortable at the summit." The day of departure arrived with startling swiftness. After an emotional goodbye to Emily, who extracted promises of daily video calls and Parisian souvenirs, Sarah found herself boarding a private jet with James. The luxury of the aircraft was overwhelming: buttery leather seats, polished wood tables, and a flight attendant who offered champagne as soon as they were airborne. "Is this how you always travel?" Sarah asked, trying to mask her amazement as she sank into the plush seat. James shrugged, already reviewing documents on his tablet. "It's practical. Commercial flights waste time with delays and security lines. This way, I can work efficiently before we arrive." Sarah nodded, though practical was hardly the word she would use to describe the opulent surroundings. As the jet climbed higher, she gazed out the window, watching Vancouver shrink beneath them. A mix of excitement and anxiety swirled in her stomach. She was heading to Paris with one of the most successful businessmen in the country, about to attend an event with the culinary elite. It was so far removed from her normal life that it hardly seemed real. During the long flight, James finally set aside his work and engaged Sarah in conversation. They discussed the summit agenda, the chefs they would meet, and the dishes they might taste. As the hours passed, Sarah's nervousness gradually eased, replaced by genuine enthusiasm for the experience ahead. "There's something I should tell you," James said as they began their descent into Paris. "The media will be at the summit, and they'll be curious about you." Sarah frowned. "About me? Why would they care about me?" James looked slightly uncomfortable. "I'm a relatively public figure, and I don't typically bring companions to these events." "They'll speculate." "Speculate?" Sarah repeated, then understanding dawned. "Oh. They'll think that this is." "I'll make it clear you're a valued colleague," James assured her. "Just be prepared for some attention." Sarah nodded, though the thought of media scrutiny added another layer of anxiety to the trip. As the jet touched down in Paris, she took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever lay ahead. The city was even more beautiful than Sarah had imagined. Their chauffeur drove them from the airport through historic streets lined with elegant buildings, each more charming than the last. The hotel James had selected was a masterpiece of old-world luxury, with a view of the Seine that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "It's magnificent," she whispered, standing at the window of her suite, watching riverboats glide past. James, who had escorted her to the room, smiled at her reaction. "Paris has that effect on people. Why don't you rest for a bit? I'll meet you in the lobby at 7 for dinner." Left alone in the sumptuous suite, Sarah took a moment to simply absorb her surroundings. The canopied bed, the antique furniture, the marble bathroom with its deep soaking tub, it was like something from a fairy tale. On an impulse, she video called Emily, giving her a virtual tour of the room. "It's like you're a princess, Mom," Emily exclaimed, her face pressed close to the screen. Sarah laughed, comforted by the connection to home. "Hardly. But it is pretty amazing." After the call, she prepared for dinner, selecting one of the simpler dresses from her new wardrobe, a deep burgundy wrap dress that flattered her figure without being too formal. As she applied minimal makeup and styled her hair, Sarah realized she was genuinely looking forward to the evening. Dinner was at a small bistro known for its authentic French cuisine rather than its celebrity clientele. It was a thoughtful choice on James's part, allowing Sarah to experience the food without the pressure of a high-profile setting. The intimate space was lit by candles, creating pools of golden light that softened everything they touched. "This is perfect," Sarah said as they were seated at a corner table. "I was worried you'd take me somewhere intimidatingly fancy for my first night in Paris." James smiled, his features relaxed in the candlelight. "There'll be plenty of formality at the summit. Tonight is about enjoying the food." And enjoy it they did. Sarah savored each dish with undisguised pleasure, from the delicate amuse-bouche to the rich chocolate dessert. James watched her reactions with evident enjoyment, occasionally asking for her assessment of a particular flavor or technique. "What would you have done differently?" he asked as she tasted the coq au vin. Sarah considered the question seriously. "Less reduction on the sauce, perhaps a touch more acid to balance the richness. But it's still extraordinary." After dinner, they strolled along the Seine, the city lights reflecting on the dark water. The Eiffel Tower sparkled in the distance, and the mild spring air carried the scent of flowers from nearby gardens. It was a perfect Parisian evening, the kind tourists dreamed of experiencing. "Thank you for bringing me here," Sarah said softly, pausing to lean against the stone parapet. "I never imagined I'd see Paris like this." James stood beside her, their shoulders almost touching. "Paris should be experienced properly the first time," he said, his voice equally quiet. "Too many people rush from landmark to landmark, never really seeing the city itself." They stood in companionable silence, watching a tour boat glide past, its lights illuminating the faces of delighted passengers. The moment felt suspended in time, charged with unspoken possibilities. "We should get back," James said finally, his voice regaining its usual brisk tone. "Tomorrow is the first day of the summit, and we'll need to be sharp." The summit itself was held in a grand exhibition hall, transformed into a showcase of global cuisine. Renowned chefs demonstrated techniques, food scientists presented innovations, and critics debated culinary trends. Sarah was initially overwhelmed by the scale and sophistication of the event, but James remained a steady presence at her side, introducing her to key figures with a confidence that suggested she belonged there. "This is Sarah Johnson, my culinary consultant," he would say, and each time, Sarah stood a little straighter, her own confidence growing with each introduction. By the second day, Sarah was actively participating in discussions, offering insights that drew appreciative nods from established chefs. Her natural ability to identify flavors and suggest improvements caught the attention of several prominent figures, including Jean-Pierre Laurent, a 3-star Michelin chef known for his innovative approach. "You have a remarkable palate, Madame Johnson," Laurent commented after Sarah accurately identified the unusual spice blend in his signature dish. "Have you considered formal training?" Before Sarah could respond, A sleek blonde woman approached, inserting herself into the conversation with practiced grace. "Jean-Pierre, darling, I've been looking for you everywhere," she purred, air-kissing the chef before turning a cool gaze on Sarah. "And James, what a surprise to see you here." James's expression remained neutral, though Sarah noticed a slight tension in his posture. "Melanie, I didn't realize you were attending this year." "Last-minute decision," she replied, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "I'm covering the summit for Gastronomy magazine." She turned to Sarah, assessing her with a glance that managed to be both dismissive and curious. "And you are?" "Sarah Johnson," Sarah replied, extending her hand. "I work with James on culinary development for his hotels." Melanie shook her hand with cool politeness. "How fascinating. And your background is in hospitality management, I assume?" "Actually," Sarah began, but James interrupted smoothly. "Sarah has an exceptional talent for flavor profiles and menu development. She's already transformed the dining experience at several of our properties." Melanie raised a perfectly shaped eyebrow. "Well, isn't that interesting? I'd love to hear more about your unconventional career path. Perhaps over drinks later." The invitation was clearly a challenge, but before Sarah could respond, an announcement called attendees to the next demonstration. With a practiced smile, Melanie excused herself, promising to catch up properly with James before the summit concluded. "Who was that?" Sarah asked as they made their way through the crowd. James's expression was unreadable. "Melanie DuPont. Food critic, social climber, and someone who enjoys making others uncomfortable. Don't let her bother you." But there was clearly history there, and Sarah couldn't help but wonder about the nature of James's relationship with the elegant critic. The question lingered in her mind throughout the day, an unwelcome distraction from the otherwise exhilarating experience of the summit. That evening, as they attended a gala dinner featuring creations from the world's top chefs, Sarah found herself seated at a table with Melanie and several other influential figures in the food world. James was across the room, engaged in conversation with potential investors for his newest hotel project. "So, Sarah," Melanie began, her voice silky with false warmth, "James tells me you're transforming his hotel's culinary offerings. What exactly is your methodology?" The question was innocent enough, but Sarah sensed the trap beneath the surface. Around the table, conversations quieted as others turned to listen. Taking a measured sip of wine, Sarah met Melanie's gaze directly. "I believe in honoring ingredients, in understanding the science behind cooking, and in creating memorable experiences for diners. But most importantly, I believe food should be honest, no pretensions, no gimmicks, just genuine flavor and careful technique." There was a moment of silence, then Pierre Laurent nodded approvingly. "Well said, Madame Johnson. Honesty in cooking, this is the foundation of all great cuisine." Melanie's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "How refreshing," she said, a hint of sarcasm in her tone. "And how did you and James meet? It's an unusual partnership." "Actually, Ms. DuPont, I find it quite natural," came James's voice from behind them. He had approached their table unnoticed, his expression pleasant but his eyes sharp. "The best partnerships often come from unexpected places, don't you agree?" The rest of the evening passed without incident, but Sarah remained aware of Melanie's calculating gaze following her movements. It was clear the critic viewed her as a threat, though whether professionally or personally, Sarah couldn't determine. Later that night, as Sarah and James strolled back to their hotel through the moonlit streets of Paris, she finally gathered the courage to ask the question that had been troubling her. "You and Melanie, were you involved?" James slowed his pace, his expression thoughtful. "Briefly, years ago. It didn't end well." "She seems to hold a grudge," Sarah observed cautiously. James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Melanie expects certain things from life: social status, influence, power. She thought I could provide those things, and she was prepared to be the perfect corporate wife in return. When I made it clear I wasn't interested in that kind of arrangement, she took it personally. And now she sees me as competition," Sarah concluded, understanding dawning. James stopped walking, turning to face her directly. "You're nothing like Melanie, Sarah. That's why she feels threatened. You're authentic, talented, kind, everything she pretends to be but isn't." The sincerity in his voice warmed Sarah more than she wanted to admit. They stood there on the Parisian sidewalk, surrounded by centuries of history and romance, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. "We should get back," Sarah said softly, echoing his words from the previous night. "Tomorrow's another busy day." As they resumed walking, James tentatively took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes about the shifting nature of their relationship. Sarah didn't pull away, instead allowing herself to enjoy the moment, the warmth of his hand, the beauty of Paris at night, and the growing certainty that this trip was changing everything between them. In the days that followed, Sarah would find herself navigating not only the complexities of the culinary summit but also the evolving connection with James and the subtle machinations of Melanie, who seemed determined to undermine her at every turn. Yet, amidst the challenges, Sarah discovered a newfound confidence in her abilities and a deepening trust in the feelings developing between her and James. Paris, the city of light and love, was working its magic on both of them, breaking down the barriers they had built around their hearts and opening up possibilities neither had dared to imagine before. As the summit progressed, not everyone was pleased with Sarah's presence or her growing influence. Melanie Dupont, with her impeccable connections in the Parisian social scene, began a subtle but persistent campaign to undermine Sarah's credibility. What started as pointed questions about her background evolved into thinly veiled insinuations about her relationship with James. "It's fascinating how quickly some people rise in this industry with the right connections," Melanie remarked loudly at a champagne reception, her gaze fixed meaningfully on Sarah from across the room. The comment rippled through the assembled guests, eliciting curious glances and raised eyebrows. Sarah felt her cheeks burn, but she maintained her composure, engaging in conversation with a sympathetic pastry chef who either hadn't heard Melanie's barb or chose to ignore it. Later that evening, as Sarah retreated to the hotel's terrace for a moment of quiet, she was surprised when Jean-Pierre Laurent joined her, offering a glass of cognac. "Do not let her troubled words disturb you," he advised, his French accent thickening with emotion. "Melanie, she has always used her sharp tongue to cut others down. It is her way of feeling important." Sarah sipped the cognac, savoring its warmth. "I don't understand why she's targeting me. I'm not a threat to her." Laurent chuckled, the sound warm in the cool evening air. "Ah, but you are, ma chère. You are genuine, and in our world of pretensions, authenticity is revolutionary. Also," he added with a knowing smile, "Monsieur Anderson looks at you with eyes that have never looked at Melanie." Before Sarah could respond to this surprising observation, her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from James: "Need to speak with you urgently." Meeting room B. Excusing herself, Sarah made her way through the hotel to the small conference room where she found James pacing, his expression tense. The moment she entered, he looked up, relief washing over his features. "There you are. I've been trying to reach you." "I was on the terrace," Sarah explained. "What's wrong? You look stressed." James ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she now recognized as a sign of his agitation. "I just received a call from Vancouver. There's a problem with the Montreal project." Sarah listened as James explained the situation. A key investor had pulled out unexpectedly, putting the entire development at risk. The financial implications were significant, potentially affecting all of his properties if not addressed quickly. "I may need to cut the trip short," he concluded, frustration evident in his voice. "Head back tomorrow to handle this personally." Sarah felt a pang of disappointment, but she understood the seriousness of the situation. "Of course, you should go. The summit is nearly over anyway." James hesitated, studying her face. "I don't want to leave you here alone, especially with Melanie circling like a shark." The concern in his voice touched Sarah. "I can handle Melanie," she assured him, with more confidence than she felt. "Your business needs you." They discussed logistics, agreeing that Sarah would stay until the summit's conclusion while James returned to Vancouver to address the crisis. As they finalized the details, Sarah couldn't help but notice the strain in James's features, the weight of responsibility evident in the set of his shoulders. "James," she said softly, placing a hand on his arm. "It will be okay. You've faced bigger challenges than this." He looked down at her hand, then up at her face, something vulnerable in his gaze. "I don't want this trip to end like this." Paris was supposed to be. He stopped himself, shaking his head. "Paris was supposed to be what?" Sarah prompted gently. James sighed, a rueful smile touching his lips. "Special. For both of us." The admission hung in the air between them, laden with implications neither was ready to fully address. Sarah felt her heart quicken, aware that they were standing at the edge of something profound. "It still is special," she said finally. "And we'll have other opportunities. Go save your hotel. I'll be fine here." James nodded, though reluctance still shadowed his expression. "At least let me take you to dinner tonight, before I leave. One last evening in Paris." Sarah agreed, and they parted to prepare for the evening. As she dressed for dinner, selecting a deep blue gown that the personal shopper had insisted flattered her coloring, Sarah reflected on the unexpected turn events had taken. She had come to Paris for professional development, not anticipating the emotional journey that would accompany it. Dinner was at Le Jules Verne, the famed restaurant situated within the Eiffel Tower itself. As the elevator carried them up to the dining room, Sarah marveled at the changing perspective of the city spreading out beneath them. The restaurant's interior was elegant yet understated, allowing the spectacular view to remain the focal point. "This is incredible," Sarah breathed as they were seated at a window table, the city lights twinkling below like earthbound stars. James smiled, the tension of earlier partially eased. "If we're having one last dinner in Paris, it should be memorable." The meal was exquisite, each course a masterpiece of culinary artistry. They discussed the summit, the chefs they had met, the techniques they had observed, carefully avoiding more personal topics. It was only as dessert was served, a delicate chocolate creation paired with a rare cognac, that James broached the subject of their return to Vancouver. "When we go back," he began, his tone measured, "things will be different." Sarah looked up from her dessert, meeting his gaze. Different how? James hesitated, choosing his words carefully. The press will have questions. About us, about your role in the company. People like Melanie will spread rumors. Are you concerned about your reputation? Sarah asked, unable to keep a hint of defensiveness from her voice. No, James replied firmly. I'm concerned about yours. The media can be cruel, and someone with Melanie's connections could make things difficult. Sarah considered this, absently swirling the cognac in her glass. So what are you suggesting? Clarity, James said simply. When we return, I want to clarify your position within the company, officially promote you to Director of Culinary Development, with a proper contract and compensation. No room for misinterpretation or gossip. The offer was generous, professional, and strangely disappointing. Sarah had expected or perhaps hoped for something more personal. She nodded slowly, forcing a smile. That sounds sensible, she agreed, trying to mask her conflicted feelings. James studied her for a moment, then reached across the table to take her hand. Sarah, that's the professional side of things. Personally. He paused, seeming to struggle with what to say next. Personally, I'd like to explore what's happening between us, away from the business, away from the public eye. If that's something you want to. The honesty of his admission, the vulnerability in his expression, caught Sarah off guard. She looked at their joined hands, then out at the Paris skyline, her heart racing with possibility and fear. I think I'd like that, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The relief in James's smile was palpable. The remainder of the evening passed in a warm glow of anticipation and connection, the looming business crisis temporarily set aside as they savored their last night in Paris together. The following morning, as Sarah accompanied James to the airport, the reality of their situation reasserted itself. The crisis in Montreal demanded immediate attention, and the professional responsibilities they both carried couldn't be ignored. At the private terminal, James turned to Sarah, his expression serious. I'll have my assistant arrange for your return flight in 2 days. Enjoy the rest of the summit, and... He hesitated, then leaned in to kiss her cheek, his lips lingering for a moment. Take care of yourself, Sarah. As the private jet took off, carrying James back to Vancouver and the waiting crisis, Sarah felt a mix of emotions swirling within her. Excitement about the possibilities he had hinted at, concern for the business challenge he faced, and a lingering worry about returning to reality after the magic of Paris. Her concerns were validated that very afternoon when she encountered Melanie at a panel discussion on sustainable cooking practices. The critic approached with a saccharine smile, her eyes gleaming with malicious curiosity. I hear James had to rush home, she commented, sipping champagne with practiced elegance. Left you all alone in the city of love. How tragic. Sarah maintained her composure, meeting Melanie's gaze steadily. Business emergencies don't wait for convenient timing. The summit concludes tomorrow anyway. Melanie's smile sharpened. Yes, but what happens after the summit, I wonder? Will you return to, what was it you did before? Housekeeping, wasn't it? The question was designed to humiliate, to remind Sarah of the vast difference in their social standing. But Sarah had endured far worse challenges than the barbs of a jealous socialite. Actually, she replied calmly, I'll be returning to my role as Director of Culinary Development for Anderson Hotels. But thank you for your concern about my career, Melanie. It's touching. Melanie's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing slightly. How convenient that sleeping with the boss comes with such perks. Sarah felt her temper flare, but she kept her voice even. You know, Melanie, I used to wonder why someone like you would feel threatened by someone like me. Now I understand. It must be exhausting, constantly manipulating and plotting, never truly connecting with anyone. I pity you. Without waiting for a response, Sarah turned and walked away, her head high. The confrontation left her shaken but resolute. If this was a preview of the challenges awaiting her return to Vancouver, she needed to be prepared. The final day of the summit passed in a blur of networking and farewells. Sarah exchanged contact information with several chefs who had expressed interest in her perspective, including Jean-Pierre Laurent, who offered her an open invitation to visit his kitchen whenever she was in Paris. You have the soul of a chef, Madame Johnson, he told her warmly. Whether you wear the whites or not, you understand the heart of cooking. This is rare. His validation meant more to Sarah than all the formal credentials in the world. As she packed her belongings that evening, preparing for the return flight James had arranged, she reflected on how much had changed in just 1 week. She had arrived in Paris unsure of her place, questioning her abilities. She was leaving with new confidence, valuable connections, and the possibility of a relationship with a man who saw and appreciated her true self. Of course, challenges awaited them: the Montreal crisis, the media scrutiny, the social barriers that still existed between them. But Sarah had faced insurmountable odds before and persevered. With James at her side, she felt ready to take on whatever came next. As her taxi wound through the streets of Paris toward the airport, Sarah took one last look at the city that had changed her life. Au revoir, Paris, she whispered. Until we meet again. Little did she know that the greatest challenges and the most profound rewards still lay ahead, waiting for her return to Vancouver. In the face of adversity, James decided to take a bold step. He called a press conference to address the rumors surrounding his relationship with Sarah. Standing before a room full of reporters, he spoke candidly about Sarah's talents and their professional collaboration. James made it clear that Sarah's promotion was a result of her hard work and unique skills, not their personal connection. He publicly acknowledged her contributions, silencing critics and reinforcing his belief in her abilities. The conference was a turning point, solidifying their bond and dispelling doubts about their relationship. With the scandal behind them, James took Sarah out for a romantic dinner at a quaint Parisian bistro. As they shared a bottle of wine, he reflected on how far they had come. Their journey from a chance encounter in a hotel bathroom to partners in both business and life was nothing short of remarkable. Moved by the moment, James reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. With sincerity in his eyes, he asked Sarah to marry him, expressing his desire to build a future together. Overwhelmed with emotion, Sarah accepted, knowing she had found a partner who valued and cherished her for who she was. Returning home from Paris, Sarah and James began planning their wedding. They chose a beautiful garden by the sea as their venue, surrounded by friends and family. The ceremony was a celebration of love, resilience, and the unexpected journey that had brought them together. 2 weeks after their wedding, Sarah was surprised to discover she was pregnant. She shared the news with James, who was overjoyed at the prospect of starting a family. The couple embraced the new chapter of their lives with excitement and anticipation, ready to face whatever the future held. Together, James and Sarah continued to innovate within the hospitality industry, blending their talents and passions to create something extraordinary. Their partnership was a testament to the power of love and perseverance, a reminder that even the most unlikely encounters can lead to the most beautiful stories. In 2025, the story of Sarah and James resonates deeply as a testament to the enduring values of perseverance, authenticity, and the courage to embrace change. In an era where rapid technological advancements and societal shifts often leave individuals feeling disconnected or undervalued, this narrative highlights the importance of recognizing and nurturing hidden talents, regardless of age or background. Sarah's journey from a janitor to a respected culinary expert underscores the idea that it's never too late to reinvent oneself or pursue a passion. Her story encourages us to look beyond societal labels and see the potential within each person. Similarly, James' transformation from a focused CEO to a partner who values genuine connections serves as a reminder that success is not solely defined by professional achievements but also by the quality of our relationships. As we navigate 2025, the lessons from their story remind us to foster environments where diverse talents are celebrated, to remain open to unexpected opportunities, and to prioritize meaningful connections over superficial success. Ultimately, Sarah and James' journey teaches us that true fulfillment comes from embracing life's unexpected paths with courage and an open heart. Dear viewers, as you journey with Sarah and James through their transformative adventure, we invite you to become a part of their story. Your insights and reflections are invaluable in shaping their next steps. How do you envision Sarah and James navigating the challenges of their new chapter in life? What advice would you offer Sarah as she continues to explore her culinary talents? How can James further balance his corporate responsibilities with his newfound appreciation for personal connections? We encourage you to share your comments and suggestions on how their story could unfold. Perhaps you see Sarah taking on a mentorship role, inspiring others to pursue their hidden talents. Or maybe you imagine James championing a movement within his industry to prioritize employee well-being and fulfillment. Consider an open-ended conclusion where Sarah and James embark on a joint venture, traveling the world to discover and promote diverse culinary traditions, leaving room for new adventures and growth. Your feedback can help craft a narrative that resonates with readers worldwide. Join the conversation and help us explore the endless possibilities for Sarah and James' future. Your voice is the key to continuing this compelling journey.